Chapter 1. The Boundless Sea. Waves taller than the highest steeple rolled the ship, the Agatha, around like a toy in a bathtub, threatening to turn the vessel into a pile of matchsticks. The winter storm had struck without warning, and so far, only the fast thinking and expertise of the ship's captain was saving them from destruction. In the distance, and struggling in the furious storm, were half a dozen Sarpi warships. As soon as they departed Calderia and set out to sea, the enemy had been waiting. Only the Agatha's speed had allowed them to evade their pursuers. Soaked and struggling to regain his footing on the slippery deck, Luxon Edioz did his best not to throw up the meal he'd eaten earlier that morning. Above, huge roiling clouds spewed snow and torrential rain, whilst thunder and lightning raged. His long leather cape coat was having little success at keeping him dry from the waves lashing the ship. Up ahead, and standing on the quarterdeck, was Captain Whitelaw the Mad Wise. The bald man had his arms spread wide and was cackling maniacally as seawater splashed over his bare torso. Luxon staggered over to him, and the helmsman, who was battling with the ship's wheel to keep the vessel under control.
"Ah, Master Wizard, isn't this not glorious? Does this not make you feel alive?"
Whitelaw shouted over the howling winds and booming sea. "That's not how I describe it, Captain. We're getting tossed around like a rag doll. Is there anything I can do?" Luxon shouted back as a wave broke over the deck. A panicked cry came from one of the crewmen in the rigging. The sailor was desperately trying to pull in one of the sails but slipped. With a cry, he fell, but managed to grab hold of a rope and cling on for dear life. Luxon crouched next to the helmsman and focused his magic. The storm made it hard to concentrate, but he quickly felt the tingling of his powers fill his body. He reached out with a telekinesis spell, catching the sailor just as a wave swatted him off the rigging. The spell caught him, preventing the screaming man from being thrown overboard and into the merciless water. With a movement of his hand, Luxon guided the floating sailor back to the relative safety of the deck.
"Nice catch!"
Whitelaw cackled. A worried shout came from the helmsman. Luxon followed the direction the man was pointing at. A massive wave, taller than all the others, was coming straight at them. It was the size of a mountain, and, as it drew closer, its shadow loomed over the ship. Whitelaw grabbed a rope and began tying it about his waist. The other crew members on deck did likewise.
"I suggest you do the same, Master Wizard. This is going to be a little rough,"
Whitelaw said, with a twinkle in his eye. Luxon gulped and did as suggested. He took the rope offered to him by Whitelaw and rapidly began tying it around his waist. Water poured into his eyes, and he could feel it soaking through his overcoat. The massive wave struck, causing the Agatha to climb the wall of water at a near 90-degree angle. On and on it climbed, until it looked as though the wave would snap the ship like a twig. The magical runes carved into the ship's hull glowed brightly as the magics within did its work. Luxon cried out, expecting the ship to flip over. To everyone's relief, the ship crested the summit of the waves, only to plunge down the other side. The descent was 100 feet, almost causing Luxon to spew his guts everywhere. Another shout of alarm came from the deck. A fork of lightning split the sky, illuminating the giant waves. Even in the turmoil of the thrashing sea, the flash revealed a massive shadow moving against the storm. Luxon's stomach flipped at the sight. Even Whitelaw looked afraid.
"Fell beast!"
the captain bellowed. He grabbed the petrified helmsman and set him back to his task.
"Don't make it easy for the bloody thing!"
Luxon staggered over to the deck's rail, his eyes fixed on the shadow. He couldn't make out any details of the beast, but it was massive in size. Giant taloned flippers were the only prominent feature. The ship began to rise again as it rode another giant wave. The fell beast, however, launched itself through the water to push its way through the other side of the wave. Luxon shouted a warning as the creature took up position right where the Agatha was due to fall. A long, lean snout, itself the length of a ship, burst out of the water and opened wide to reveal a cavernous mouth filled with razor-sharp teeth. Luxon turned his head to see Captain Whitelaw grab the ship's wheel to help the helmsman steer the vessel away from the monster's cavernous mouth. The two men strained, and the Agatha turned just in time, narrowly avoiding the fell beast's snapping jaws. As the ship turned, the crew hastily armed themselves with bows, crossbows, and whatever else they could get their hands on. Luxon struggled towards the hatch that led below deck. He had to warn Ferren and the others. The beast exploded through another wave, sending a wall of water smashing down onto the deck. Luxon was swept off his feet, only the guardrail stopping him from being tossed overboard. Other crew members weren't so lucky. 3 sailors fell screaming into the icy cold waters of the deep. Luxon dared a glance behind them and saw their Sarpy pursuers trying to escape the storm and the fell beast's wrath. He watched in horror as a monstrous wave smashed one of the enemy ships, scattering men and material into the inky depths.
"Man the harpoons!"
Whitelaw bellowed to his men. The Agatha was equipped with 2 large harpoon guns, located on the foredeck. Fell beasts of the void were a terror the world over, and often ships were destroyed by their talons or tentacles. As a result, most merchant ships that dared venture into the deep ocean were armed with harpoons or ballista. The cyclone began to weaken just as quickly as it had arrived. The waves remained rough and tumbling, but the howling wind and rains were moving quickly eastwards towards the continent of Delfinnia, now a brown smudge on the distant horizon. With the storm quickly passing overhead, the fell beast was revealed in all its horror. Luxon clung to the guardrail and gasped. He'd read tales of the fell beasts that used the Spurious Oceans as their hunting grounds, but he'd never really believed them. The monster that was now stalking the Agatha was larger than any creature he'd ever seen, including the dragons. Ferren and his fellow Nightblade Wellesley emerged from below deck. The specialist monster hunters ran over to the rail and helped Luxon back onto his unsteady feet. "What is it?" Luxon asked, unable to take his eyes off the beast pursuing the ship. Captain Whitelaw hurled insults at his men as he ordered them to unfurl the sails. With the storm over, it was now safe to use the mainsails once more. The sailors moved through the rigging with incredible skill and agility as they unhooked ropes and pulled pulleys. Within moments, the mainsail was deployed. The massive piece of blue fabric unfurled and flapped before catching the wind. With a whoosh, the sail deployed, and with a jolt, the Agatha surged forward, picking up speed.
"It's a Leviathan,"
Ferren said in awe.
"There are void rifts deep beneath the waves just as there are rifts on the land. No Nightblade has ever best one."
Suddenly, a melody began to play, causing everyone to look at the deck. The bard, a reaper, stood there, her fingers playing expertly over the strings of her lute. Her blonde hair billowed, and her long red bard's cape whipped behind her in the wind. She began to sing. Her voice rose above the roar of the waves and pierced the heart of every man on board. It was a song of the storms and seas, one of a tempest's passing. Her song was magical. Lightning lit up the sky, and the rain still fell, but the intensity of the storm began to fade. A reaper winked at Luxon and the Nightblades as she continued to play her tune. With the storm weakening, the Agatha was able to pick up speed. The monstrous beast was now in pursuit, the waves parting as its enormous bulk barreled through the water. The Agatha's crew was shooting their weapons to try and scare the beast off. Luxon watched as a harpoon struck the Leviathan, only for it to spin wildly off its thick skin. "I have an idea," Luxon said as he rushed to the hatch and clambered down into the hold where they were billeted. Next to his wildly swinging hammock was a chest containing his valuables. He opened it and reached inside. His fingers tightened around a long, wooden object, the dragon-enchanted staff, Dragostol. A whimper caused him to look up. Cowering in the darkness of the cabin was Aldelaide. The boy king looked positively terrified. Luxon hurried over to him. "You okay, sire?" he asked. The words still felt strange to him, knowing that the boy and rightful ruler of Delfinnia was, in fact, his half-brother. Kneeling next to the bleary-eyed lad, he took his hand in his own. "It'll be over soon. Stay down here and keep your head down," he said. He looked over his shoulder to see Sophia staggering over to them. The witch-hunter looked wretched. The sea had not been kind to her stomach. "I'll keep an eye on him," she said, weakly. Luxon nodded and picked up his staff. He ran back to the ladder and looked at them both. "Stay strong," he added, before climbing back to the deck. Arepa was still singing, her voice somehow carrying loud and clear over the roar of the waves and Leviathan. The crew grew increasingly desperate as they continued to shoot every harpoon they had at the rapidly gaining fellbeast. Luxon ran to the aft deck and raised Dragostol high. He focused on the fading storm. He could feel its weakening power, and he latched onto it. With a loud crack of thunder, lightning split the sky and struck the tip of the staff. The hairs on his body stood on end as Dragostol absorbed the power of the bolt. Electricity crackled and fizzed about him until, with a shout, he thrust the staff towards the approaching monster. Blinding white-hot power lanced out from Dragostol, striking the Leviathan. Electricity mixed with seawater, vaporizing the tough outer skin of the creature. The beast roared in pain, but still it came. "Shoot everything you've got!" Luxon commanded the crew. The sailors loosed a volley of arrows and harpoons, and this time the deadly projectiles hit their mark. The lightning, having exposed the soft tissue underneath, allowed the harpoons to punch deep. Luxon ran to the ship's aft and watched in awe as the massive creature reeled back in agony. The Nightblades dashed to the rail and together pulled their banishing vials from the pouches on their belts.
"We could use a boost here, Luxon,"
Ferren shouted as he arched his arm back, ready to throw the vial. Luxon nodded and focused. "Now!" he shouted. Ferren and Wellesley hurled the vials as hard as they could. Just as they reached their zenith, Luxon pushed with telekinesis to send the vials soaring through the air, where they shattered against the writhing Leviathan. Instantly, a blinding light flashed into existence as two portals to the void ripped open. An unnatural wind began to blow, threatening to pull the ship and its crew towards the tear. Vast amounts of seawater was sucked into the powerful vortex, including the Leviathan. At first, it seemed like the massive creature would escape the pull of the magic portal, but the wounds inflicted upon it by the Agatha's crew took their toll, and soon its strength faded. With a last roar, the Leviathan disappeared into the portal with a flash. With its purpose fulfilled, the portal collapsed in on itself to leave tumultuous waves in its wake. The Agatha lurched forward once more as the pull of the void rift disappeared, and Arepa's strange song continued to calm the sea. The crew cheered and let out laughs of disbelief at surviving their encounter with the beast of the void and the storm. Luxon couldn't help but laugh with them. Whitelaw clapped him on the shoulder and cackled before pacing down the deck to inspect the ship.
"I can't believe it. A Leviathan. I'd read about them in the old tomes from Calderi's library, but never in a million years did I expect to ever set eyes on one,"
Wellesley was saying to Ferren in excited tones as the two Nightblades walked towards the aft. In the days of the world-spanning Golden Empire, Nightblades had been common on the high seas, but after the Empire's collapse and the subsequent decline in global trade, ships travelling from one continent to another became rarer and rarer, until now, millennia later, the other lands were nothing more than a myth.
"It doesn't bode well that we encountered one so soon into the voyage. We've been at sea for what, a week? If the maps Thanos recovered from Calderi's archive are correct, then we have a long way to go until we reach Tulin,"
Ferren said with his arms crossed. "We lost the Sarpy, though, so that's one positive," Wellesley said, trying to brighten the mood. Luxon looked to the horizon, not to the west where they were sailing, but back towards Delfinnia and the friends they had left behind. Dark clouds swirled in the far distance. He hoped they were not an ominous sign. As evening fell, the waves remained large, but the Agatha rode them well. Below decks, Luxon and the others joined Captain Whitelaw in his cabin for dinner. The room was the largest on board, and dominated by a round wooden table that was firmly anchored to the floor. The walls were decorated with a range of exotic and bizarre items. On one of the shelves was a glass case containing a tiny human-shaped skull. Luxon had asked Whitelaw about it on their first night at sea.
"That, there, is a skull of what the Yundals call a half-man. I bought it from a bazaar on the island of Misen, a strange land just west of an iron spine. That impassable barrier of rock that runs for thousands of miles south, and a merchant told me of a chain of islands to the east of Yundalis that was home to all sorts of weird creatures. I sailed to them once, and by Niverin, the tales were true. Half-men! A real! Whole tribes of them there are! Nasty cannibals to boot.
Tonight, Luxon and the captain were joined by Aripa, Wellesley, and Aldelaide. Farron, meanwhile, was tending to Sophia, who was still suffering from seasickness. The food on offer was surprisingly extravagant, a plate of cooked salmon and crispy potatoes. Thanks to the magical runes carved into the Agatha's hull, the contents of the ship's larder was perpetually frozen in a time loop, resulting in all the food inside remaining as fresh as the day was first produced. Such magical binding was hugely expensive, suggesting that Whitelaw was far wealthier than he first appeared. After the food had been eaten, Whitelaw poured himself a glass of Robinton wine before passing the bottle to Aripa. Leaning back in his chair, he planted his booted feet on the table and belched loudly. Aldelaide looked aghast at the captain's poor manners. Wellesley chuckled and shook his head.
So, Aripa, it seems there's a lot more to you than meets the eye,
the captain said, with a twinkle in his eye. A smile formed on Aripa's lips as she poured herself a glass. She took a sip before fixing the men in the room with a mischievous glint.
I was born in Rurin, somewhere in the Robinton jungle, and spent much of my youth on the road. As you know, the Rurin are nomadic people that never settled in one place for long. Famous for our music, and as entertainers we would travel from town to town, peddling our skills for coin.
That explains why you're so, talented with the lute, Wellesley said. Aripa flashed the Nightblade a smile that would have sent most men weak at the knees, and from the way Wellesley's face flushed a deep red, it appeared he was not immune to her charms.
I played the lute in our family band with my brothers and sisters. We were famous in the East for a time, at least until I discovered I was a wielder.
How did you find out? Luxon asked, intrigued. Discovering that you could use magic was often a traumatic experience for the person and their family. With the laws of Delfinnia decreeing that no magic could be practiced outside of Calderia, many kept their powers a secret, often resulting in tragedy further down the road. Usually, as an untrained wielder grew older, their powers would manifest until either they hurt themselves or someone close to them. Hiding the truth also meant that they would likely become a target for witch hunters or the Knights of Niverin. He had been fortunate that his mother, a powerful wielder herself, had recognized the signs when they had first manifested themselves, when he was just 10 years old.
We were playing in Balnor for the Feast of the Brave Knight. I must have been 12 at the time. Anyway, as we were playing the Ballad of Estran, the crowd began acting strangely. I was singing about Estran's fall, and as I sang those words, the entire crowd fell to the ground, fast asleep. Naturally, we all panicked, not knowing what had happened, but there was one older man in the crowd still standing. He looked exhausted, as though he were struggling to stay awake, but he walked over to us and told us he was a wielder, and that we had to flee the city. We ran and hid in the woods, but the strange man found us again the next morning.
Luxon leaned back in his chair and finished his glass of wine. Who was he? He asked.
He told us his name was Alpha, and that he was a Nightblade. He explained that one of us had used song magic, a very powerful gift. He asked each of my sisters and me to sing a song, one after the other. Nothing happened when my siblings sang, but then it was my turn. As I sang, I could feel a tingling sensation pass through my body, and as I sang, the woods darkened despite the sun being high and bright.
I've read about song magic in Calderia's library. It's incredibly rare, and recorded instances of it are even rarer. What did you sing to make the woods darken? Aripa brushed a stray strand of blonde hair behind her ear before answering.
It was an old nursery rhyme about the age of darkness. You know, one of the songs intended to spook children into behaving. Once I stopped singing, Arthur spoke to my parents and told them I had to go to Calderia. Naturally, they were devastated, but understood the law. Reluctantly, they handed me over to the old man. He took me north to the mages, and I then spent the next 10 years in Calderia, learning to control my powers. The mages quickly deduced that I was no threat, as unlike them I can only use magic through songs.
Aldelaide raised an eyebrow and banged a hand on the table.
But you're a reaper, the famous bard. You travel the kingdom singing your songs. Have you been bewitching people all this time?
The king demanded in his boyish voice. Arepa smiled at the confused and slightly annoyed expression on the king's face.
I can control my powers now, sire. I can sing normally, but if the need for it occurs, as it did today, I can use my magic. I've never duped anyone into liking my voice. Perhaps one day you'll ask me to sing at your wedding?
She replied with a smile. Aldelayde's face flushed.
I am far too young for that nonsense.
The young king grumbled. Arepa reached for the wine bottle and poured herself another glass.
So, what about our fearsome leader, the mighty wizard? When did you discover you had magic?
Luxon shook his head.
It's a dull tale, and one that cannot compete with yours,
he said dismissively.
Tell us, Luxon!
Aldelayde pressed. Luxon sighed and leant forward in his chair so that his hands lay flat on the dining table.
The truth is, I didn't know I was a wielder until my mother took me to Calderia. Before that, I had no idea I could use magic. The mages took me in, and over time and intensive study, I managed to tap into it gradually. Little did anyone know at the time that a wizard's powers manifest differently to mages. As a thaumaturgist, emotions tended to act as a catalyst to start with, but once I got them under control, it came to me as naturally as breathing. I think somehow my mother always knew. She must have seen your greatness,
Arepa said. Luxon nodded absently. A dark mood fell over him as he thought of his mother. The pain of her death was still raw, and merely thinking of her almost always overwhelmed him with sadness. He put down his wineglass and excused himself from the cabin.
Was it something I said?
Arepa asked as the door closed. Leave him be, lass. There is more pain and sorrow in that wizard's soul than he lets on, I think, Whitelaw said, as he poured them all another round of drinks. Chapter 1. The Boundless Sea. Waves taller than the highest steeple rolled the ship, the Agatha, around like a toy in a bathtub, threatening to turn the vessel into a pile of matchsticks. The winter storm had struck without warning, and so far, only the fast thinking and expertise of the ship's captain was saving them